All right. Today is January 25th, 2023. My name is Dr. Jason Higgins. I am in Williamsburg at the University Libraries at the College of William and Mary today in Williamsburg, Virginia. Joining me today for an oral history interview is Steve Sober, a Vietnam War veteran, a member of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, a professional musician, and a gamer or RC flight.
Yeah.
All right. A man of many interests and hobbies. This interview is part of a project titled Crossing the Military-Civilian Divide. Before we get started, do I have your permission to record the interview?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'll start with a couple of biographical questions related to your military service. What was your highest rank?
I was a specialist fourth class.
And any medals or citations that you care to mention?
Just the standard good conduct medal, Vietnam service, campaign, and national defense.
Do you recall your enlistment dates, the years of service?
February 13th, 1967.
And when did you get out?
September around 16th, 1969.
And you deployed to Vietnam, is that correct? Did you deploy to Vietnam?
I was there for 1 year, 5 months, and 17 days, I think.
That's longer than the standard.
Well, I volunteered to stay in order to get a 5-month early out from the Army.
I'm sure there's a story behind that decision as well.
A lot of people who were supposed to be enthusiastic just wanted out. So a lot of people took that early out.
Right. A couple more questions about that. Do you have a service-connected disability?
10%.
And do you have diagnosed PTSD?
Not diagnosed.
But you think maybe there's some aftermath of that
I have to keep the nightmares at bay.
Do you have access to counseling services if you needed it?
Yes.
I like to ask that question because talking about these memories can bring it to the surface, and I just want to make sure that you have access in case you need it.
Well, my memories are not nearly as gruesome as most might have, because I was a finance clerk, company clerk, a truck driver on the beach. So what I saw was aftermath, not directly involved.
Thank you for that. So I want to take a step backwards, and can you just tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in May 1948 in Antananarivo, Madagascar. I can take it from there if you'd like and give you a little history.
Yes, please.
My dad was a foreign service officer. He was an expert in French and wanted a French posting when he decided to join the foreign service with my mom. So they sent him to Antananarivo, which was an ex-French colony, number 2 man in the 2-man mission. So I was born there, and after a year or so, we got reassigned to Czechoslovakia, Prague, where my sister was born in September of 1949, where the embassy was thrown out by the new communist government there. My dad helped some Czechs escape. Another story. And we ended up in Reykjavik, Iceland for a couple of years. Then Dad had a semester at Northwestern University in Chicago, which was the first time I'd been in the U.S. We were there for, 3 months or so. And then it was Turkey, Ankara, Turkey for 3 years. Then back to Washington, where the first time I was in school in the U.S. was 3rd grade, I guess. In and out of different schools in the U.S., a public school, a private school, 6th grade, 7th grade, midway through 7th grade, he was assigned to Bombay, India. So I spent 9th and 10th 8th, ninth, and 10th grades there. 7th, 8th, and ninth, somewhere around in there. A little foggy at this point. And we came back to Washington. He was assigned at the Army War College for a year, and I'd been set up to go to another boarding school. Arrangements had been made, but then he was reassigned to Washington, and so I was only there for 1 year. So 8 schools by the time I graduated high school.
That's quite a disruption in your education. Did you find it difficult to adjust to new schools and make new friendships along the way?
No, actually, that was pretty easy. The hard part was leaving. It's just serial deaths, people that you get to know, and suddenly they're no longer part of your lives ever. So that's been part of my background for a long time. And yeah, there were downsides to that kind of a background, but I was also exposed to things that make me who I am, and I'm pretty happy with that. So in the end.
And we can always come back to this at the end of the interview, but I am really interested in how that international perspective from an early age shaped your understanding of the United States, its role in the world, and your father's influence on those beliefs. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. I guess political consciousness really started around ninth grade or so in India. There was a swimming pool, saltwater swimming pool, right on the ocean, Indian Ocean, in Bombay, that was open only to what they call Europeans, whites. And my dad never went. Dad had a Jewish background. He was never religious, at least in my lifetime. And he didn't go because he was nervous about the discrimination. So that was the first time I had any inkling of race, if you will. And then when I got back to the States, I went to 10th grade. I went to a Quaker coeducational boarding school for a year outside of Philadelphia, the George School. And that's where I learned about real racial discrimination in Philadelphia. So up until that point, I was really totally blind.
Now,
Right.
the Quakers had been an activist organization for a very long time. Did you witness or experience any of that aspect of the Quakers, or, yeah?
Well, this is 62, 63, so it's before Vietnam was really raging. Let me back up just a little bit. Before we went to India, I think it was early 60, we were at the National Zoo in D.C. And I'm, 12 years old at this point. I look up and I see a very thin Asian man, and I'm looking at the thing on his shoulder, and it says, Wyatt Nam, something like that. And Dad said, oh, there's a little conflict going on in Southeast Asia, and these were people here learning how to fight. I'll never forget that.
So that was the first time you'd heard Vietnam.
Yes, it is.
Wow. Now, in these areas like Madagascar, you mentioned former colonies. In that time, were you aware of colonialism, living in India?
India.
Yeah.
Yeah. India was, it's almost impossible to relate unless you've been there and been in it. Well, like so many things. I was white American. I rode my bicycle all over the city, rode the trains, third class, along with the mass of humanity, stepping over dead bodies sometimes in the mornings on the sidewalks, watching the sewers being used actively as toilets.
That must have been shocking for you as a young person.
It wasn't shocking for me, really. I guess having lived in Turkey, where I guess I remember seeing a lamb slaughtered for Ramadan, so I'd already been exposed to, I was more used to non-white foreigners than I was to Americans. I only lived in the U.S. for a couple of years, really. So a lot of my perspective comes from friends who came from across. I still am in touch regularly on Facebook, thank you, with a friend I met in Bombay who lives in Jakarta. He's a devout Muslim, helped set up Pacific airline reservation systems. Brilliant, wonderful guy. Yeah, all of my Vietnam friends have passed, so I've outlived them all.
So to kind of go back to that moment in the early 1960s, were there formative international or national events that you can recall directly having an impact on you? For example, Kennedy's assassination?
Well, earlier than that, since Dad was in the Foreign Service and one of his very best friends was also, I remember the Suez Crisis from '56 as being the first time that I was alerted to the deadliness of the world. When I grew up, we had the Life magazine had a huge red coffee table book about World War II, and I know every picture and can pretty much tell you where they were taken. So that was part of my upbringing too. I remember reading Winston Churchill's books about the war. I could read the words. I had no idea what he was saying really, but that was all there too.
Did that influence you in wanting to join the military from a younger age?
No, I wanted to be a pilot when I was a kid, and I found out that I was horribly colorblind. And I've gotten much better, really, with colors, oddly enough, but my wife is an artist, and when I'm really seeing green, but it's mostly red, or actually I'm very good with the greens, but bad with the reds. So piloting was out, and had little interest in the military. I spent a semester at Dickinson University in '67, late '66, and I was in the ROTC, Pershing Rifle Drill Team, and was headed probably into a reserve officer. But I just wasn't ready. I'd only been back from India for a couple of years, and I had little idea really what I wanted to do or where I was going or what the hell was going on. It was really a foggy period. And then the draft came up. Yeah, I remember just to go back a little bit to Kennedy assassination, I was in a 10th grade history class at the George School, the private school, and professor went out and came back sobbing. These were events that shook me for sure, but really never set off much political consciousness. That really came when I came back from Vietnam.
We can get to that. What year did you graduate from high school?
1966.
Okay.
66.
That's a really important time. That's a buildup of U.S. troops in Vietnam at that time. The draft was going full on. At what point did you become aware that you might become drafted?
Oh, that threat was, if you weren't in college, you were going to be drafted pretty much. So there wasn't any doubt about that.
So even though you were kind of struggling to find yourself, as you kind of put it, in college, you decided not to stay in college even in the face of a threat like the draft.
I decided to avoid the draft by enlisting because I could choose my initial MOS. And I was, my first semester at Dickinson, I got a Dickinson varsity letter for a rifle team. I was an expert, real expert shot. And I didn't want to I just it's going to be military service. Put me where maybe you can use my brain. I really don't want to go out there killing agents.
Did you have a conversation with your parents about that before actually enlisting in the military?
No, not really. It was either get draft or join.
And while I'm thinking about your parents, I never really got much information about your mother. What did she do? Did she work? Your mom?
Mom was born in Judsonia, Arkansas. My grandfather on that side was a railroad engineer in World War I and worked with Union Pacific building bridges for his career. She wanted to leave so badly. She listened to opera all the time on radio and just wanted to leave. When Washington kind of opened up and she was right here, living with some relatives on her side, working at the War Department and Army Transportation.
I can relate to wanting to leave Arkansas. I'm from Arkansas, so I get it.
Well, we fled North Carolina. That was another story.
Okay.
Recently.
So she kind of sounds like she followed your father around the world after leaving Arkansas.
She did, yeah. Dad had been working in Army Transportation in Bermuda before the war. And he came walking into the office wearing his Navy uniform. He was a lieutenant junior grademan in the Pacific on a destroyer. He came walking in, and that was it. She saw him, and they ended up getting married and having me and my sister.
Is your sister older than you or younger?
She was a year behind, a year and a half. She passed away in '79.
My condolences to you. All right, so going back, you're 1966, and you're aware that you might be drafted, and you volunteer in order to get a better occupation in the military. What occupation did you ultimately get?
Well, I volunteered for administration, and that was basically typing school at Fort Dix after basic at Fort Bragg, and then they wanted me to go to code school. A number of opportunities they wanted for me. All of them required more time in service, and I didn't know. I ended up as a finance clerk. I'm a 73C20. And because I'd been around the world, I knew my geography. I ended up being the travel clerk wherever I worked, paying people for coming and going. So I got to see a lot of records. I got to see a lot of people. My first post was in New York at Fort Hamilton on one side of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. For some reason, I knew how to drive, so they gave me a vehicle to drive. They gave me the company car to drive. And my job was to make sure it had X number of miles on it every month. If that meant taking a tour of Long Island and coming back, or taking the laundry up to West Point, leaving it there, and then going back up to West Point and bringing it back, well, that was fine. It was all putting miles on the car that they didn't want to lose if they didn't use it enough. And then my first stint on KP in basic training, I was a squad leader for the first 5 of 8 weeks. Then they fired me because I couldn't keep up on the marches back from the sands. I had really bad shin splints, and I'd come struggling back. I had flat feet. None of that mattered in 1967.
Right, they were looking for more bodies.
It didn't make any difference. I had flesh. Now I could see. So anyway, I had that driving job. I ended up driving a 20-passenger bus after they transferred me to cross the river to Staten Island on the other side of the Verrazano Bridge. I was still doing travel, but I was also driving a 20-passenger bus loaded with $1 million in cash, 45 loaded Phu Hiep MPs, 4 and aft with submachine guns, paying people coming back from Europe. They were heading into the States to get flights and that kind of stuff. So that kind of experience stayed with me when I was assigned to Vietnam in February of '68. I got orders.
That's right, at the Tet Offensive.
Yeah.
So to slow down just a little bit before getting to Vietnam, how did you adjust to military life in general?
I'll make it simple. I hated every minute of it. In Vietnam, there were times that I could get away because I was company clerk and truck driver, and it gave me a lot of freedom that nobody else had. It was one of the reasons, anyway, that I took it. A friend who passed away that I finally, I'm getting circular here. Anyway, I was.
What exactly did you not like about the military, like the military itself, before going to Vietnam?
Being a squad leader in basic training, I was exempted from KP and exempted from stoking the coal-fired ovens at Fort Bragg in the winter, February, bitter cold. But the way people were treated was just egregious. In Hindi, there's an expression, Chota Nawab. It means petty prince. And you had people that were petty princes doing things that were, a little over the edge. I think I've maybe come to a slightly different feeling about it now because these guys were, the drill sergeants were combat vets and they were just trying to save our asses ahead of time. But that wasn't real clear at the time. It was just a lot of nonsense. It was unnecessary. But then maybe it wasn't. Other people have that experience, not me.
So kind of the roles of the regimen, you kind of, would you say that you rebelled against that system mentally?
No, not really. I had work to do, and I wanted to do the best I could, and it kept me involved, engaged, and best way to pass the time.
Sure. Did you get in any type of disciplinary issues before going to Vietnam? Did you get in trouble?
In Vietnam, I did.
Oh, you did. Well, we can get to that then. So you shipped out to Vietnam in February of 1968. Did you
Well, no,
fly?
I actually got my orders in February. I shipped out, I think, in March. I can't remember if I actually got there in early April or late March, something like that.
How did you arrive?
How did I arrive?
Yeah.
Well, I was on leave at home in Washington, D.C., where my parents lived, and got on a taxi to a national airport. That flew me to Seattle, SeaTac. Went to Fort Lewis, did a little bit of training there, some other processing. Got on another plane. I can't remember what airline it was. It might have been TWA, but I just don't remember. That flew to Anchorage, and then to Tokyo, and then to Cam Bay.
Cam Bay. What was it like whenever you arrived? What was your first impression?
Well, after this long flight, we arrive in Cam Bay, and I'm put on KP. I got to prepare the mess for incoming flight. So my first experience there was, at work already, not much chance to do anything. The first I remember being on my own there, some guys had taken me up to the top of a hill. They were getting high on pot, watching the flares and the artillery going off across the bay. Oh, this is interesting. So I was in Cam Bay just a couple of days. Then they sent me up to Nha Trang, 22nd Finance in Nha Trang, where I became travel clerk. But was only there for a month. Then they sent me up to Tuiwa Sub-Area Command, Phu Hiep, where I stayed for the next 16 months.
What did your average day look like?
Well, let me just tell you, on the way up to Phu Hiep, on a helicopter, the commander, the colonel commanding the Phu Hiep installation, had a revolver on his hip, a revolver, not a pistol, a revolver. And the story was that this was one wild place where only to kind of put him up there in Phu Hiep. So on the way up here with my shiny green fatigues, the door gunner leans over and says, "Don't worry, I'm just test firing the guns." Thank you. Might not have been pretty if they'd gone off, and I didn't know that in advance. So we get up at Phu Hiep and land at the, get up to Nha Trang. Phu Hiep was a helicopter flight. No. It was the flight from Cam Ranh Bay to Nha Trang, where the gunner let me know. And I took a C-130 from Nha Trang to Phu Hiep, and I remember landing at Nha Trang Air Force Base. It's one of those steel kind of runways that they put down really fast. They built that thing in like 6 months. And I thought the plane had crashed. It was so rough coming down on that runway like that. I'd never been on a C-130. I thought we'd crashed, and fortunately not. So the first sergeant, Sergeant Carroll B. Palmer, I'll never forget him because he was the best NCO I ever served with, came pick me up on the company Jeep. I've got some pictures of him in the Jeep. Does he take the road to Phu Hiep back from Tuiwa Air Force Base? No, he decides to take the ditch because it's muddy and he's got a Jeep with four-wheel drive. So we had a gas doing that little trip. I'll never forget it. And for some reason, anyway, I became company clerk of the finance unit. Kind of on the spot. I don't know why. All right, so that's getting me to Phu Hiep now. And where were we headed? I thought you had a question.
Well, the question I asked earlier was, I was just trying to get a sense of like what your average day would be like in your location.
Well, 6.5 days a week. We're at a desk. We get up, go to breakfast. Breakfast was reasonable. It was the only reasonable food you could really expect during the day. Sea rations, that was, company clerk made that easy. We get up, go to work, I don't remember what time, maybe 8 o'clock. I think the office hours on a picture that I have. People would troop in, sit at my desk, do their paperwork. The rest of the company, most of them were doing monthly payroll. So mine was kind of is a unique role in a finance unit. And most of the guys were not finance MOS. They were on-the-job training sent over from their units to take care of the unit payroll. So it would just be working, playing fly golf. You know, par was one fly, one swat with the swatter. We had quickly built wooden barracks with tin roofs, corrugated tin roofs, and screens up high, and the offices were like that too. So I have a picture of me in an office that looked more like an office. I guess that was where I sat when I was doing the company clerk thing. I kind of forget some of those details. We moved. We were in that one place for about a year, maybe a little more than a year, and then we moved to occupy the 92nd Evac hospital compound. They'd moved, and they moved us out, closed that unit down.
That sounds like a very different type of situation, an evacuation hospital.
We're right next to an evacuation hospital and an Army airfield. I spent time in the evacuation hospital, and I spent time at the Army airfield, hitchhiking on helicopters, doing various company errands.
Now, during your first assignment, what did you do on your off time, on your downtime?
During my first assignment
Yeah.
in New York,
No, in Vietnam.
in Vietnam. Well, the beach was right there. Spent a lot of time sitting on the beach. Music, records, I ended up with the biggest record collection in the area. I remember when the Beatles' White Album came out, news that I had it hit, and I had people coming from 20 miles both sides
Great album.
to listen, yeah. So I must have had hundreds of albums. I was buying out everybody as they left.
Were you playing music at that time too?
Yep,
Did you have a guitar with you?
I did. At one point, I think I had 3. I went to Hong Kong for my first R&R after I'd been there for a year and brought back 3 guitars. I went over there with a Martin 0016 NY, I still remember it, a great little Martin guitar. And my mother always remarked, hey, he goes off to a fighting war and he's got a guitar with him.
Sounds like you were very popular among the troops.
With some and not with others.
Fair. So in 1968, I really am curious about the availability of drugs. Was marijuana or even heroin available in that area at that time?
Yeah.
And did you? I mean, I don't want to incriminate anyone, but
I smoked pot there. Marijuana saved my life.
In what way?
Calm and focus. Get rid of the other nightmares. Didn't start in Vietnam.
Sure.
So it has been through my life, actually. Never been an impediment. I look around at people out there and they're saying, who's impaired? So a lot of my friends were the pot smokers. A lot of them weren't. The best people were the people that didn't really matter. My first sergeant, Sergeant Palmer, Master Sergeant, he used to test me all the time. I'd come into the office and he'd have an errand for me to do, and he'd throw me the keys, hoping that I'd miss them or be incapacitated or impaired. I never missed. The only time I ever got into a little problem with him, the 2.5-ton truck that I drove, we discovered it had a leak in the brake line going to the rear brakes. So, wait a minute. The front or rear brakes, my good friend Dirk Wieland, who was a tool and die maker, got a nail and stuck it in one of the brake lines so I could lock the rear brakes up and still have the front driving. And since the street in front of our hooch was kind of on the beach, it was sandy, I would come in and I could do a 180 with the brakes locked in the rear 10, and the hooch mates loved it, the rear 8. It was a 10-wheel truck. And he saw me one day and said, you can't drive anymore. Well, nobody else wanted to drive the truck or maintain it or even knew how. So that lasted a day or two.
Now, how far would those trips in the truck have been? How far would you have been traveling?
Well, the barracks was maybe a couple of miles away from the office. The office was next, it was the other side of the evacuation hospital, the other side of the airfield. And So that was probably going to be a 2-mile walk in the morning and 2-mile walk back in the afternoon, which is why we had the truck lent to us.
Were there threats along the road?
No, south of the, well, there was the air base, then there was an ammunition dump, bomb dump, then there was one of the Phu Hiep fishing villages. I have pictures from the guard tower and the machine gun looking over it. Then our compound, then another fishing village, then the air base, then the hospital, then the PX, then an artillery unit, and south of that was the Korean infantry. And they were not messed with.
The Koreans had a reputation for brutality in the war. Were you aware of that at the time? Is that what you're saying?
Not really, no. But I did see some martial arts demonstrations that they did, which hard to credit that they were actually doing what they did. And we knew that the VC wanted to stay way far away. So for the year and a half I was there, we had a couple of alerts. Never any incoming in my compound. The air base blew up. Tuiwa Air Base was hit. The ammo dump was hit. The airfield below us was hit. And they wanted to get the hospital for Tet, but that was broken up by the 82nd Airborne. So I read some of that history. I think it was the 82nd. The herd, anyway.
Did you interact with Vietnamese civilians?
I did.
Can you talk about that?
Well, I could speak un peu français, and in Nha Trang, which had been a French resort city, beautiful beach city, I was able to speak to an older man briefly, and my French wasn't really that deep, but it was pretty clear there. And then again in Tuiwa, where I met an old man that I could speak to. And that's where I began to get uneasiness about what we were doing, because they were telling me things in French that they wouldn't say in English. Almost certain that they wouldn't be talking about national pride. I can't remember much, but I do remember that was the beginnings of my, what the hell are we doing? And that was odd because, well, not so odd. I don't want to lose track here if I get back to what I'm thinking about, but where were we?
Well, I'm just interested in your interactions with civilians and, how they were treated in your experience and what you witnessed.
Well, we had hooch maids, and we had a papasan and his son who did various odd jobs around the place, and all got along very well.
Now, for Madison and other people who might not know what a hooch maid is, can you talk about that?
We had, in our situation, we had little 8x8 wooden areas where we would live. We'd bunk. And in some cases there would be 2 people. I think in mine must have been smaller. I only had 1. They were called hooches. And the hooch maids would come in, do the beds, do the laundry. So I'd pick them up every morning and take them back to the village.
Did you or other Americans have relationships with these women?
Others did, for sure. The guard tower was well known as a passing place. People going into the village at night and coming back. because the minefield didn't go into the ocean. It ended at the ocean, and so that was a regular, yeah.
I kind of want to go back to your speaking French and your international perspective and the roots of kind of your consciousness about the war in Vietnam. While you were in Vietnam, did your ideas about the war start changing? Can you talk about that process for you?
I was I was too wrapped up in what I was doing and the situation I was in. For the first year I was there or so, it was really very, very easygoing, the 22nd Finance. Company commander just wanted people to get the work done well, and there was a field of excellence for the work that was being done, and especially the guys who were on the job training. But sometime around January of '69 or so, a new guy came to take over the company, and we switched headquarters from Nha Trang to Quy Nhon and became 13th Finance. An interesting number, 13th. Because the guy that took over was a martinet and a racist from Georgia. And a lot of us really, really, really hated him. And he wanted to get me in the worst way. He came up, I was on guard duty one night, and he snuck up on the guard tower. And I didn't hear him until he was up the ladder. And I turned around and locked and loaded on him. I was about to blow him away. That came that close to it, not knowing who he was. But he was up there trying to catch me on sleep or something like that. Well, I'm sorry, my eyes are out here over the lights where the village is. I don't expect to be somebody attacking me from my own compound. My commanding officer, not the guard, the officer of the guard, not the sergeant of the guard, my commanding officer. This was a personal vendetta, God knows why. But from that moment on, life became hell for me and for a lot of other guys that just wanted to be left alone and get their work done. He came in spanking, shiny uniform and polished boots. My boots were the color of my shoes. Everybody's were. We were in a sandy beach, for Christ's sake. Who needed their fucking boots polished? Sorry.
No apologies are necessary.
Well, I'm trying to be restrained.
Sure. And that was about a year into your tour?
About a year, yeah. I went on leave, Hong Kong R&R in January or February of '69, after I'd been there about a year. Brought back a bunch of guitars, and right around that time this guy came up, took off.
That sounds like a really extreme difference between your former commanding officer and your new one.
Night and day. Night and day. Sergeant Palmer, who I'd mentioned earlier, had left. And we had another NCO, I can't remember his name. He was okay. And he tried to keep some distance for us. I give him credit for that. But he didn't. Sometime in May of '69, this brilliant wonder of military genius decided that we were in danger of being attacked by our hooch maids, if not VC scuba divers who were going to attack us on the beach from their fishing boats, which were offshore every night with candles going, with strings up. So he told a newly minted sergeant, he ordered us to keep our rifles locked in our lockers. Well, there'd been a VC almost overrun compound south of us, about 12 miles south in Vung Ro Bay, and a lot of us were not going to lock our fucking rifles in our lockers. It's just not going to happen. But I got reported, put me on an Article 15, which restricted me to the barracks or the Red Cross facility, the enlisted men's club. Well, we didn't have a lot of those things because the orders came down from Queen Yan, where they did, and where we were, we didn't have. There's a lot of side things here that I kind of insert at one point. Around that same time, February of '69, the Secretary of State, William Rogers, was doing a world tour from west to east. And my dad was responsible for making all the arrangements from Thailand back to the United States, but was able to hitchhike the flight that ended up in Tan Son Nhut.
Your dad did?
I did. And I have pictures of him. I flew down to visit him. I was restricted now for this Article 15. My dad would never have lifted a finger he had no influence anyway, and some people might have thought an official like that did. He didn't and wouldn't. Nevertheless, when I went up to tell the smart nut that my dad was going to be on the plane with the Secretary of State and wanted me to come down and meet him in Saigon, he really couldn't say no. It was bullshit about the rifles in the lockers. Another one of his little tricks, mustache. We had the mustache crew. A lot of us were growing junior mustaches, and he would have us line up and order us to cut it within the bounds of our mouth here, because he couldn't grow any peach fuzz.
Petty Prince.
Bobby Milton, I think he's, anyway.
So I've read a lot and talked to Vietnam veterans about how unpopular officers like that would have been dealt with in the bush, right, out in the field. But I'm curious, like, how did the enlisted men respond to unpopular officers where you were?
I don't know.
Were there any threats against his life?
Not that I know of, no. The compound was pretty peaceful, really. After the VC threat at Tet, going after the hospital, was torn up before it happened. There were some attacks, as I said, north and south of us, but nothing directly on the compound.
You mentioned that he was from Georgia and that he was a racist. Were there, how did he interact with black troops in your experience?
We had one black guy who was there for OJT, and he was supposed to have been learning how to do payroll. Well, he had him sweeping the floors. One day, a black captain came into the office. He'd flown in from combat zone, I don't know where, and there was some irregularities with his paperwork regarding payroll for the troops in the field. And I could see the racism prevented him from going back to his troops with his payroll. It wouldn't have happened to anybody else. I'm certain of that.
Do you think that anti-black racism translated toward anti-Vietnamese people sentiments as well? Did he treat the civilians poorly?
I think anti-civilian, anti-Vietnamese is all wrapped up, yes, in the same racism that we know and hate today. It's all part and parcel to the American right wing. Sorry, but it's so patently obvious now. I remember those arguments starting in Vietnam to a certain degree, but they came to a fore when we marched from Trenton to Valley Forge, past a couple of VFW posts.
As a member of the VVAW.
That's later.
So you were transferred to another area. Can you talk about that?
In Vietnam?
Yeah.
No. I was there only 1 month in the Trang, and
Okay.
the rest of the time was all in Phu Hiep. The company changed with this guy and then reassigned it from 22nd to 13th Finance.
Can you talk about your memories of being close to the field hospital?
Well, I ended up with a pilonidal cystectomy, what they used to call truck driver's disease. Pilonidal gland right at the base of your spine, and those Army truck seats are very hard. Yeah, cushion about like that, but it's all canvas. And that was the only time I spent there. I was there for, I don't know, they did a spinal tap, and I must have been there a week. Have a picture of me in bed with Gypsy Rose Lee, who came to visit.
Can you talk about that?
Well, she was just touring, who wanted to visit the troops, and I was in a bed, and she came by and sat next to me and posed for a picture, which I only found a couple of years ago. I'd completely forgotten about it. But down the ward, there was screaming. A cook had set a fire on purpose using gasoline and burned. The helicopters were coming in all the time. Planes would go off the field. They had Army observation planes, the Mohawk, 3-tail, twin-engine jobs. We didn't see much of that. I knew about it because there was not as much paperwork going out as came in. And he did have a sense there was, a lot of deaths.
At that time, did you feel guilty that you weren't more involved directly with the combat?
No. We all had a job to do, and I was cognizant of my incredibly good luck. Roger Fleming had been the truck driver. Came to me, he was a good friend, good buddy, and convinced me to take the job because nobody else really wanted it, but I'd be able to, the truck would need maintenance, I'd take it down to the yard for maintenance, I'd go up to the Air Force Base to pick up the mail, take the guys up to Cholewa City on Sunday afternoon for recreation of many sorts. And he was right about that. He came back. He was assigned to a artillery something, I think, here in El Paso, maybe, I can't remember. Anyway, he hated it, volunteered to come back. So he did. But by the time he came back, the truck was gone. We only had the Jeep. That was when we moved from one compound 2 miles away from the office to the office, basically. So where was I? How did I get off on Roger?
Well, I did want to talk about friendships. Are there other friends that you want to mention?
Well, Dirk Wieland was a San Francisco, Los Angeles guy that I met. He was a tool and die maker. And he was the guy who helped me fix the truck, brake lines. He was with the company 544th Maintenance, I can't remember, transportation company. He and I were pretty close. We, on occasion, grab a joint and go sit in one of the great big huge tires as big as this, as tall as the ceiling, and get lost among a sea of these things. Or dumped Connex containers right near the minefield. They were just kind of waste and areas we could get away. And he was fascinated with my foreign experience, and I was fascinated with his California experience. But I went out and stayed with him for about a year and a half after I came back.
What did you plan to do after you got out of the military? While you were in Vietnam, did you make plans? Did you and other soldiers talk about what it would be like whenever you got home?
I had one goal, and that was to come back and kiss the ground. In the end, it was too cold when we did, but no, I had no idea. I figured it would probably be back to school, and it was. I went back to AU, got involved with comparative religion and philosophy, creative writing. Did that for a while until I met or ran into Roy Buchanan. If you're a guitar player, you'd know that name. Rolling Stones wanted him. Other people wanted him. He was a phenomenal genius guitar player. He didn't have a driver's license. And when his wife got pregnant, I would drive him back and forth, play some guitar background for him while he was working on his first album. And that took me out of school. I decided I was into comparative religion because I had so many questions I wanted to answer, but they were for myself. I was never interested in trying to convince others or to expose others to it. Once I got my answers, that was enough. And so I decided to become a guitar player, which I did. And Roy Buchanan taught me most of what I do really well.
You mentioned the number 13. You've mentioned a couple of other things that made me think to ask you about, like, superstition. Did you or other people in Vietnam have, like, superstitious beliefs or, like, something you did for luck?
I didn't. I don't know anybody else that did, really. And I only mentioned 13 because it's 13, not because of any superstition.
Sure. I've just read a lot about soldiers, more combat troops who, are very superstitious in Vietnam, especially if, like, they only have a little bit of time left on their tour. And so I was just kind of interested in that.
Don't really know much about that. Anything, really.
Sure. Could you talk a little bit more about how you got involved in photography? Did that start while you were in Vietnam?
No. As I said, my dad was a Lieutenant JG on a destroyer, and he was also kind of the unofficial photographer. So he had a book, photographs, that included Tokyo Bay after the war, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima, which he visited in October of 1945 from the ship. That book has been lost, the biggest treasure of our lives, and don't know what happened to it. I think he lost it at a convention. So that was all very much part of my growing up, that book, those pictures, the wrecked ships, Hiroshima. My dad took the picture. And he always took 8mm wind-up camera films. I've got boxes of them at home. Don't know what to do with. I don't think there are any from Madagascar, maybe some stills, but the reels definitely started in Czechoslovakia and continued from there through Pakistan, where he was charge d'affaires, deputy chief of mission. So on the way to India, we were in Naples, and we went shopping. He bought me a Zeiss Cantina. Little not fixed lens, just a little, I can't remember the word I'm looking for, viewfinder camera, and got me interested in that a little bit. In college at Dickinson, I ended up spending many hours in the darkroom. I did photography for the sports photography for the college paper, that kind of stuff. Got heavily involved. And in Vietnam, bought a Nikon FTN, which was stolen by some Vietnamese kids off the Jeep, because the new guy didn't do what I told him to do. Keep your eyes on the camera and don't look away. Don't let the kids distract you. I ripped it right off. Oh, I was so angry. And I told him time and time again to watch out for it. New guys, FNGs, you know that term?
Fucking new guy, yeah.
Had 2 more stolen right after I got home. Second R&R in Hong Kong was buying camera equipment for me and a couple more guitars. And that got stolen a month after I got home, along with my folks leaving for Pakistan a month after I got home. So that kind of came home. My sister had gotten married to a neighbor down the street. My folks were in Pakistan, and I was kind of homeless. What do you do? I got a place in Georgetown, a room right on M Street, where I ended up playing M Street with bands for years before we met.
Now, can you talk about what it was like coming home? Where did you arrive whenever you got to the United States?
We came back Fort Lewis again, SeaTac Airport. I remember I'd been able to save some of my really worn out fatigues and boots from the Georgia monster, who had ordered us to wear new fatigues because he didn't want to look. He only had new ones. He didn't want to be outshone by people that had been there for a while. Because if you'd been there for a while, you had a certain amount of automatic respect. I could walk up to a pilot on a helicopter window and knock on it, and I knew what the markings meant, and ask him if I could hitch a ride. And I did that a lot, doing various things. So we arrived at SeaTac wearing jungle fatigues. It was September 13th or so. It must have been about 60 degrees, maybe 59 degrees. I remember it was so cold I could barely breathe walking across the tarmac, getting inside. It was really completely frozen up. Everybody was. Landing, when the plane hit the ground, everybody was up on the seat, jumping up and down. The stewardesses, forget it. There's nothing we can do about this. I'll never forget that. So we landed at SeaTac, cold as hell. I mean, really, really bitter cold at 59 degrees. And got on buses to go to Fort Lewis. Went through some of the training grounds at Fort Lewis. There are machine guns going off and training, and everybody's holding onto their seats. You know, we know we're home, but I'll never forget that either. That was pretty wild. So a couple of days at Fort Lewis, they had to turn in those uniforms that we'd been promised we'd be able to keep. Brand new set of Class A. They didn't even have my good conduct medal, which I got in spite of the Article 15, because it was such bullshit. Um, I have a picture of my mother and I when I arrived at the house in D.C. Nothing really eventful there, except I remember we flew to Detroit, and I remember looking out the cabin at the dirty air. I'll never forget what is this just pollution that we could see from the air. After a year and a half in Vietnam and most of my life overseas where there really wasn't much, that was a surprise. And then came home. As I left Washington to go to Vietnam, downtown D.C. was aflame with the riots. And when I came back, it was aflame with a heroin epidemic. Remember that too.
So you're talking about the assassination of Dr. King whenever you left, right? In 1968, and then coming home to drug problems in your community?
Oh, well, I was living downtown D.C., as I told you, until I started school again in January of 70. Yeah. Time's kind of foggy.
Did you find it difficult to readjust to being back in the United States after being in Vietnam for more than a year?
I don't know that it was necessarily. It took me a number of years just to kind of figure out what was going on, really. I'd intended music to be a career, and we were house band at the Crazy Horse in Georgetown 1 week every month. It was a good band, popular. But when I met Carrie, I realized I didn't want to be on the road anymore. So I started teaching. Taught for Charlie Bird's Music House in D.C. Did that for about darn close to 10 years. No, I really didn't have. I can't ascribe any issues that I had necessarily to Vietnam. I was pretty just. I was everywhere in my thinking. Just. It was tough, but the early 70s, it was kind of all a fog anyway, I think.
Can you talk about your relationship with your father, like especially as you started to have these anti-war views?
Yeah. Dad was, he truly was a genius. He graduated CCNY, he was 19. He had honors, college top honors for French. For Latin, he would have gotten them for French, but his professor, he learned years later, was anti-Semite, so he was denied. Spent time in France, spoke like a Frenchman, except maybe some of his idiom was getting a little aged the last time we were there. There's no question about love and all that, but Dad always had the government line. We were there to prevent the spread of communism throughout the rest of Southeast Asia. And it didn't spread through the rest of Southeast Asia. So from that perspective, we won the war. My issue is we didn't have to go there for there to be the same result. That war was entirely unnecessary, totally without reason. And I don't know that he ever came to that point, I ended up taking care of both my folks as they passed for a long time, and we were close. But I don't know that he ever was able to understand.
Did he accept you for your beliefs, though? Did that cause problems in your relationship once you joined the VVAW?
No, not really. And again, he was in Pakistan when I joined. They came back a couple years later. And I was only active for about 6 months. I was doing something in town, and I learned about a protest march that was going on. So I went down and got a flyer, and it talked about Operation Raw. It's March from Trenton to Valley Forge. Do you know about?
Vaguely, I know about that one. But for the people who don't know, can you talk about that?
Yeah. So it was a bunch of Vietnam veterans are going to march from Trenton to Valley Forge, and they would stop in various shopping centers along the way, armed with tiny little plastic M16s. And members of Philadelphia theater of some sort guerrilla theater of some sort would come out and pretend to be villagers. So we would go in, and actually I wasn't in that. I was driving an MGB GT, and I was kind of following the march, driving, sleeping in that thing, but keeping up with it. And that was the thing. They into the shopping center, take the villagers, tie them up, shoot them, that kind of thing. And it was just to bring attention to what we were doing. Guys had long hair, they were shaggy, and beat up uniforms, and not. I'll remember going through those VFW, in front of the VFW facilities, and people are, hey, why don't you go there, hippie? You know, wouldn't accept the fact that we were Vietnam veterans protesting the war. Wouldn't accept it. Anyway, got to Valley Forge, and there was a finale, I think at the top of a hill, and everybody kind of charged down the hill and broke the guns, and there were keynote speakers. John Kerry was there, Jane Fonda, Sutherland, Bella Abzug, others, I can't remember the names now. And I had fallen in with Mike Phelan for some reason or other, and we found ourselves in a little house, I guess part of the park.
Could you talk a little bit more about how other veterans groups treated Vietnam veterans against the war?
Well, I don't have that much experience with other veterans groups. I joined DAV, Disabled American Vets. I'm only 10%, but I thought, why not? I remember just one particular, I think it was a VFW post that we marched past. And I remember the guys out there just yelling and screaming at us, oh, you hippies, why don't you go there, and other abusive language. And that's all I remember from that period, because, well, as I told you, I was only with them for about 6 months. I can back up. I was going to talk a little bit about Valley Forge, what happened there. Well, the march ended there, and as I said, there were keynote speakers. I mentioned a couple of names. And we ended up in a house of some sort. I think it must have been a part of the park display or something. Anyway, there were a bunch of us, maybe a dozen in there, and Jane Fonda and Donald Southern were there. We were talking, and the subject of Hanoi came up, and she talked about, and I had my chronology wrong for a while. She talked about going there. They mentioned that hundreds of Americans had already been to Hanoi, and in some cases had come home with Social Security numbers or serial numbers of troops that had been in captivity with the purpose of alerting their relatives that they were alive. Yeah, I thought for years that she had been there, and that's one of the reasons they had gone, but I realize now that no, that her visit came after Operation Romp, but that was one of the reasons that they wanted to go. That, and because of what she said, the horrible destruction. We were raining down on the dams in Hanoi, we were flooding. This insane war. She was never disloyal. That episode that the anti-aircraft gun was, she was kind of duped into it stupidly, and she's said that. And there is a wonderful history, university publication of some sort that talks about Jane.
You may be talking about, the title might be Hanoi Jane.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. And just so other people are aware, this is whenever she visited North Vietnam and posed for photographs next to anti-artillery, anti-aircraft guns, right? And it was used for propaganda purposes. And but a lot of people really hated her after that. Still do, yeah, very much. There are strong opinions about her.
Well, I'm sad to say that there is a whole large percentage of American people that live on hatred and will choose anything. Why? Ignorance, largely, superstition. People live in an echo chamber, and there are just lies floating back and forth that people are witness to and give testimony to. They're lying. They're just lying. They can't get to the truth, so when it does come out, they can't deal with it. It's really very simple.
You know, one of the things that whenever I'm teaching about the Vietnam War to this generation, it's really hard to get across how unpopular the war was at the time among the American public. I think in 1970, a majority of Americans opposed the war. They thought it was morally wrong. And there's a lot of misremembering the war, especially the anti-war movement. If you look at Hollywood portrayals, it's these liberal hippies in San Francisco versus veterans who came home from the war and they're spat upon. But the fascinating thing about members of the VVAW was that there were a large number of not only active duty GIs, but also veterans who turned against the war itself. There's a question in there somewhere, and I'm curious, like, what message would you want the American public to really understand about veterans who turned against the war?
There's a lot more to patriotism than picking up a flag and waving it. There is a deep state in this country, thank God. And it has to do with being loyal to this concept we have enshrined in the Constitution. Some people must have some other document that they put in front of themselves. It's not the Constitution. Some call it the Bible, and they call it the Word of God. But it's probably a translation that's been translated since King James and on down 4 or 5 or 15 times into vernacular that they can understand today. So it's hardly that.
You mentioned that patriotism is more complicated than what people might think. Can you tell me more about that? Do you have a sense that your protest against the war was patriotic?
Well, I did volunteer for the Army to avoid the draft, as I said. But I felt it was a patriotic responsibility to do that. My dad served, my grandfather served, my uncle served in Guadalcanal all the way through the Marines in the Pacific. My grandfather served in World War I as an engineer, I told you. I don't know, we go much further back as an American family. Truth truth is not truth. What can I say? When you get into stupidity like that, at this point, I'm almost ready to throw up my hands and, leave it to you younger people. So I'm happy to have at least somebody paying attention here. And I don't know that what I have to say is anything different than most would say. What is it about patriotism? It's a responsibility for yourself. It's not the country here, it's a concept. And it means creating a space first for yourself, because you're responsible for yourself, and maybe making enough space to bring others along with you, and making sure that they're creating their space too. You can't just wave a flag and say, I'm a patriot. It has nothing to do with the flag. Heck, Memorial Day started with black people saluting like this right after the Civil War. That's Memorial Day. The Constitution, the Pledge of Allegiance. I learned the Pledge of Allegiance. Didn't have under God in it. That was added when I was in grade school. Shook me up pretty deeply. What the hell is this? Under God. I was a kid in maybe 3rd grade. 54, something like that. That's not patriotic. That's nonsense. Get that out of it. If you want to be a patriot, you read the Constitution, and if you've got a God, that goes after the Constitution when it comes to you dealing with me. You want to do whatever you want to do for yourself based on whatever you want to believe in. That's American, and it's perfectly fine too. Just stay out of my way.
You mentioned that you only were actively involved in the VVAW for 6 months. Was there a reason why you didn't?
Well, we got. I did interviews. I spoke at Lafayette Plaza. Connie Chung interviews. I was leading a lot of the marches. They're very active that fall and into the winter. And everybody wanted a peace. The socialists wanted a peace, and the yuppies, whatever. There were all kinds of groups wanted a peace of Vietnam veterans against the war. And I saw it going in an area that I wasn't really comfortable with, and I started talking about nonviolent but aggressive tactics, and I didn't think that was necessary. And at the same time, my buddy Dirk Wieland had an invitation to go out and stay with him in California and get started, and I really wanted a taste of California. So in February of that year, Bob Hoffman and I drove out in his Nissan, what do they call it then again, Datsun, in February, in a bitter blizzard across Philadelphia. He drove off the freeway. I was steering him with my voice. We finally made it. But no, it was getting. I didn't want to do the kind of protests that they were contemplating. I wasn't against it, but I didn't think it needed to be that assertive. Since then, Jack Mallory and I have been in touch on Facebook. I don't know that we met then in '70, but he kind of partnered with Mike Phelan to continue. We back to Valley Forge. Mike and I agreed that we would formalize the DC chapter and open it up, make it formal. There were already some guys living together downtown, but we decided to ramp it up. And for some reason, I became coordinator and spokesperson for a while.
If my history is correct here, in 1971, VVAW marched on the Capitol, and they threw their medals on the steps of the Capitol building. Was that after your involvement?
Yeah. We washed the Peace Memorial of blood on one march. That was at the Capitol, foot of the Capitol.
Would you have considered rejecting your medals?
Well, I didn't see the point, really. You earned them. There are other ways to protest. So I didn't, I was in Vietnam, a Vietnam Service Medal, so what? Well, and maybe if it came down to combat medals and that kind of stuff. I didn't think it, again, that was some of the tactics that I.
And there was a kind of a fracturing among the group into different organizations. It didn't last long, right? It's kind of a brief moment in history where a lot of veterans organized together, but there are other areas where that group grew. Like, for example, several were involved in the Vietnam Veterans of America afterwards. They got involved in vet centers where veterans were doing therapy sessions with other veterans. Did you ever get involved in that decade after 1970? Or once you went to California, were you still actively involved in veterans?
I got too busy, just too busy. After I met Carolyn, as I said, I didn't want to be on the road. I started teaching, then decided I needed to make a living, so I got into applications development and did that for 20 years. Then got tired of being in Washington and the traffic, couldn't stand the traffic anymore. We left for the Shenandoah Valley and some peace and quiet. And I got back into real estate, got a broker's license, and retired as a real estate broker. So I've been a professional musician, I've been a professional teacher, applications developer, consulted for the Census Bureau, Indian Health Service, etc.
After your retirement from your professional career, was there a sense of nostalgia bringing you back to other veterans, or how did you get involved again in like the VVAW today?
Well, I guess I wanted to see if I could find Roger Fleming. Roger, I talked about earlier, had been the truck driver. He was a finance clerk too, but he had convinced me that wanted to be the truck driver as well. And I'd been trying to kind of find some of the guys I served with. I knew Dirk Wieland and I kept up over the years through telephone. He passed away, 10 years ago, I know. And this doesn't have much to do with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or sideways. Decided I would try a Facebook post. So I pulled up one of my old pictures with Roger, and I'm looking to see if I can find Roger Fleming. I think he came from Virginia. I had some 300,000 likes, hundreds of thousands, I don't remember the exact number, and found Roger Fleming. This was like 10 years ago. Wow. He was dying of lung issues and hadn't seen any friends, didn't want to see anybody, but we'd been pretty close. So I drove down, he let me drive down to see him. And we, without fail, from that day on, once a week, phone call. He could barely breathe, barely talk, but it was good to touch base with him the last 2 or 3 years of his life. And in that time, I realized the power of Facebook. Also, I just retired from real estate and realized I didn't have to be quiet about my political leanings. And when our local representative, Todd Gilbert, who's now the head of the Republican House in Virginia, started talking about throwing out red meat and trying to excuse it, I caught him at it, and he didn't bother to apologize. And I realized it's time for me to speak. So I started speaking about this nonsense coming from the right concerning Obama. I drew a picture, the picture of the two of them coming off the battleship down there and saying, I immediately posted a picture and it said, mission accomplished or something like that. I started to write and started a Vietnam veteran page and put my photos on it. They're on Facebook now. And that was going very well. And I politicized it in the end. I couldn't stand the comments that were coming in.
What do you mean?
Well, I'm a very conservative Democrat. And I've had lots of conservative friends. But what's been going on here last 12 years or so is I just couldn't sit still anymore, and I figured there'd be a lot of Vietnam veterans that would feel the same way, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So I started looking for some Vietnam Veterans Against the War online, ran into Jack Mallory, and one of the guys who remembered me as Radar, a company clerk. So that's how I got back, looking for old friends.
Are there other elements of your political consciousness that are awakened today, like involving other social issues? What other kind of issues are important to you?
The abuse of media. The whole right wing, Trump, MAGA. This is not American. This is not what this country should be. This is not the Statue of Liberty welcoming the huddled masses. This is not the country that I was Seeing what I've seen beyond what most people have any imagination of through my life, and to see where we are now with the incredible opportunities for peace that we have in front of us being squandered like piss is just crushing. It's just crushing, and it doesn't seem to be much anybody can do about it. This is not what my family fought for. This is not what my family immigrated here to escape and end up in the same fucking morass they left. And it's beginning to be, I mean, I've always been concerned about the future, and that's why Carrie and I don't have any kids. We didn't want to bring people up into the world that seem to be really descending into its end, perhaps, because people are too stupid and too blinded by their own little area that they simply don't know what's going on, and they're not being told in an entertaining way enough to make them engage in it. Who's going to see this and learn anything from my experience? How many other vets that you've interviewed feel the same way I do, or even close to it? I don't know.
A lot of them do. I think that the public would be surprised how many veterans feel the same as you. I think that media, like you pointed out, there's a real problem there about how the media portrays veterans as these symbols of manhood and strength and courage and valor and patriotism. But veterans are human beings who are complex, who have differing views and beliefs and memories that shape who they are, right? There's another question in there somewhere, and I guess it might be like, if someone does watch this interview, what do you hope that they would take away from your life and learn?
I carry the Constitution in their pocket, read it, understand it, try to understand the context, and try to figure out how the right wing has abused things like the Second Amendment, which is just like the rest of their fucking cherry picking. Take what is convenient out of the Bible and thrust that in front of your face and, oh, that's inconvenient, so we'll ignore that. They do the same thing with the Constitution, the Second Amendment. Are you a member of a well-regulated militia and therefore entitled to carry whatever weapon you feel you're entitled to? Well, I was a member of a well-regulated militia. The right wing doesn't acknowledge that. It's crazy. It's crazy. And then, first cover for yourself. Try to make space for others and don't get in anybody else's way. And don't ever stop searching for the truth. It's there to find. I don't know how you get to it. It's a kind of epiphany that you have to have happen to you. I don't think you can have it caused.
You sound like a man who really believes in the founding pillars of American democracy.
Absolutely.
How, with that strong belief, what was it like watching events unfold for you on January 6, 2021?
Hideous fraud of a con man taking somehow a rightful anger at a violation of the Constitution for something that didn't happen. I mean, these aren't necessarily bad people. They're ignorant and easily conned. The whole, when did Trump start lying? I think he was lying when he took his oath of office. He had no intention of defending the Constitution. So it began with him. I was angry enough when Ryan and Romney were running Mr. Flip-Flop, and that's when I started writing on Facebook. It eventually led me back to VVAW. As I was watching this event unfold, it occurred to me that this was an utterly incompetent, poorly planned, misled, confused attempt to overtake the government. So incompetent as to defy belief. And then for these pretend Americans who say this was just nothing more than people visiting their capital, nothing happened of any significance. Well, that is what destroys freedom. That is the destruction of freedom. It is Nazi. It's communist. It's all the words that these people like to throw around and have no idea what they're talking about because they're in it. And what we have now, the mumbler of the House, Mumbler McCarthy, I'm sorry. I think he must be headed to a drag queen contest with Santos after he gets out of bed with Marjorie. I don't get it. These are not serious people. These are not responsible leaders. These are people that will kill this country.
In your view, I'm thinking maybe back to your first NCO. What makes a good leader?
A good leader?
Yeah.
First of all, you have to have lived what you command. You have to have some experience about the ramifications of what you order. You have to be totally dedicated to the book. Where do I learn about the things that I'm responsible for understanding? None of this is a requirement of politicians, I understand. They've got to convince people. But there are a lot of politicians I don't consider good leaders. So Eisenhower was a good leader. I think he made some serious mistakes, and John Foster Dulles was a nightmare. Kennedy was a good leader. Even Nixon, until this Watergate nonsense. All of our presidents, except this golden calf, that side of me, that politics started declining when George H.W. Bush was nominated at that convention, the Republican convention, where he caved to Jerry Falwell. And even Barry Goldwater was upset and realized and forecast, and he was prescient because he knew what was coming, you can't negotiate with these people. And he was frightened by the silent majority, it was called. And he was right. We're exactly in the nightmare that not only Goldwater saw, but that George Washington saw. We're here.
Well, Mr. Sober, first I want to say thank you for sharing your story with me. We have covered a lot, and a lot of my concluding type questions have been answered to a certain degree. But I want to give Madison, my research assistant, an opportunity to ask a question if she wants to. Of course, no pressure, but do speak into the microphone if you don't mind.
I don't really have any specific questions. I think Dr. Higgins covered it all, and I also just want to say thank you for being with us here today.
Well put. She pays attention. She's a really great student and a really great research assistant. I always ask this question. Is there anything throughout the interview that you wanted to talk about that I didn't think to ask, or anything that you wanted to go back to? Take your time, as much time as you need to think about that.
Well, just anecdotes, really. Give me a minute to just kind of reflect. As again, those pictures, if I had them here, would lead to stories regarding these particular guys. And as I said, most of them are of people, smiling people. No, not really. I can think about it some more as I go through the photos. And as I said, if you want to dig further, we can do that.
Yeah, I would love to see the photographs and talk to you more. It's kind of a weird experience to be invited into someone's life in an hour and a half or 2 hour interview and then only follow up via email. So feel free to contact me afterwards at any point, and I'd love to keep the conversation going. And I usually ask questions about family and children, but you made that decision not to have children, which is a very interesting one. But I guess the same principle really still applies, and I just really want to know how you want to be remembered.
How I want to be remembered?
Yeah. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
Well, I carried my own water and didn't get in the way of anybody carrying theirs, as far as I know. At one point, I was offered sergeant stripes. Sergeant Palmer said, "We need a sergeant. Would you like to be a sergeant?" And I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, well, you'd have to give up driving the truck. No thanks, Sarge. No thanks. I would have been responsible for people and telling people what to do, bringing the orders down to them. I didn't really want to do that. And I definitely wasn't going to give up the truck. That was freedom. I'm a company clerk. I get sent place to place to place. I deal with the people that have the great big, huge amphibious barges that are, the Army's trying to wear them out, sending them down to the coast to unload things that could have been shipped up by truck. But they bring the sea rations in, and I'm a finance guy. They think I have some sort of power, which I don't. But that's okay, I'll take them. Made friends with the officer in charge of the NCO club and of the officers club. They had a beautiful, heavy stone officers club sitting on the beach. There were not supposed to be any permanent buildings on this base. This was a permanent officers club. It was great. And they had nice steaks that he'd get for me. I'd take them back to the company. We'd cut open a 55-gallon oil drum and in half. Charcoal in the bottom. That was another trip to the village to pick up charcoal.
You mentioned the drums, the oil drums, and you mentioned a friend who had cancer. To your knowledge, were you ever exposed to Agent Orange?
I don't see how I couldn't have been. I flew on caribous occasionally, and they were used for sprayer. The Air Force Base had stuff all over the place. I was on the beach, so there was no need of defoliant where I was stationed. So if I was, and I'm certain I was, I don't think there's anybody who escaped it, but I don't think it's had any impact.
You haven't had any medical problems afterwards related?
Well, maybe. Maybe. Don't know.
Interesting. From my perspective, it sounds like you had a complicated war experience, some good and maybe some bad, but I'm curious, how do you memorialize? How do you remember? Have you gone, for example, to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial? Talk about that experience for you.
When I was in high school, we had a very active poker group. We'd pay, nickel, dime, quarter. $20 was a huge night, one way or the other. But it was intense poker. And Charlie McNulty was one of those guys. I came back and learned he'd just died. A lot of different stories about how. I've been down to the wall a dozen times. It's been a while since we left Washington, so it's been at least 20 years, I guess. But Charlie, I remember Charlie, a good close friend who died there. There are others that I remember, but Charlie kind of remains.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, again, I want to thank you for sharing your story with me and the students. I really feel like I learned a lot from you. I know every veteran I talk to says there's nothing really important that I did to be learned about, but I always find each interview meaningful and powerful in its own way, and this was certainly true in that and with your interview. So thank you again so much. And if after the interview you think, wow, I should have told him that story, you can always contact me later.
Okay. Well, I will go review the pictures, and I'll try to write something out for each one that'll jog my memory, and I'll send them up to you. And then we'll see.
Well, I have to say it's a real inspiration to talk to someone who feels so strongly about American democracy. I share those same values, so thank you for that.
Embassy parties, ride the camel, ride the elephant, ride the donkey.
Thanks again.
Sure.